The Menéndez brothers, a family tied by secrets, torn by desperation. In Beverly Hills, the Menéndez family lived a life that most would envy. Their mansion gleamed under the California sun, a symbol of wealth, power, and prestige. But behind the closed doors of their pristine home, darkness festered an invisible web of control, fear, and manipulation that no one could see. Lyle and Eric Menéndez were born into privilege. They had everything: fancy cars, elite education, and a lifestyle that seemed perfect from the outside. But no one knew the cost of living under their father, José Menéndez, a man who built his empire with ruthless ambition. José wasn't just a father, he was a tyrant, a man obsessed with control. José was the king in his castle, and his sons were his pawns. Every move they made was dictated by his relentless demands for success, power, and obedience. José wasn't satisfied with good, he wanted perfection. "You are nothing without me," he would remind them, his voice cutting deep. Lyle and Eric were expected to reflect his greatness, to be molded into versions of him. Lyle, the older brother, took the brunt of it. Strong, charismatic, and outwardly confident, he absorbed most of his father's fury. But inside, Lyle was suffocating under the pressure, hiding a growing resentment. He watched over Eric, his younger brother, who was more sensitive, artistic, and fragile. Eric had always been different, more emotional, more vulnerable, and their father saw this as weakness. José toyed with them like a puppeteer pulling strings, using guilt, fear, and manipulation to keep them in line. He knew how to turn Lyle and Eric against each other, planting seeds of doubt, jealousy, and insecurity. "Your brother is weak," he'd whisper to Lyle. "He needs to toughen up." And to Eric, he'd say, "Lyle only cares about himself." The brothers were caught in a silent war with each other, fighting for their father's approval while drowning in his manipulation. Yet they couldn't shake the bond they shared, a bond forged in fear and desperation. Their mother, Kitty Menéndez, was a shadow in the background. She wasn't the caring, protective mother one might expect. Instead, she drifted through life in a haze of alcohol and denial, pretending not to notice the abuse happening in her own home. She was broken in her own way, trapped in the marriage just like her sons were trapped in their father's grip. Kitty's silence screamed louder than any words could. The boys needed her, but she wasn't there. She was drowning in her own misery, leaving them to fend for themselves in the storm their father had created. By the time they reached their late teens, Lyle and Eric were living in constant fear. It wasn't just the verbal abuse, it was the psychological torture that José inflicted. He played mind games, turning their reality into a nightmare they couldn't escape. There were moments when they tried to fight back, but every time they did, José crushed them harder. He reminded them of how powerless they were, how everything they had was because of him. He controlled their futures, their money, their entire lives. But there was something even darker beneath the surface, something that Eric, especially, carried. The whispers of abuse went far deeper than the emotional and verbal cruelty that everyone saw. Eric began to break down, consumed by secrets too painful to bear. He confided in Lyle, sharing things that no one else knew, things about their father that were too horrifying to speak out loud. Lyle listened, his rage building. He had always been the protector, but now he was powerless to protect Eric from what their father was capable of. It all came to a head on one fateful night in August 1989. The pressure had been building for years, and it was about to explode. Lyle and Eric had talked in hushed voices for weeks, planning, fearing, questioning. Was there a way out? Was there any escape from the nightmare they lived in? The answer, they realized, was no. That night, Lyle and Eric walked into the family room where their parents sat watching TV. Their hearts were pounding. Everything was a blur. The fear, the desperation, the years of anger. José barely looked up, indifferent to their presence. Kitty sat silently by his side, as always. In a flash, it happened. The guns went off. The deafening sound echoed through the mansion. Jose was the first to fall, his reign of terror finally ending. Kitty screamed, but it was too late. Her silence had condemned her too. The brothers stood over their parents, breathing heavily, their minds racing. They had done it. They had broken free, but at what cost? In the days that followed, Lyle and Eric put on the performance of their lives. They cried, they mourned, they pretended to be shocked by the brutal murders of their parents. But behind the facade, they were crumbling. For a while they got away with it, but the weight of their guilt, the secrets they had carried for so long, began to tear them apart. Eric, fragile as always, cracked first. He confessed to a psychologist, unable to bear the burden any longer. The truth came spilling out, and soon the world knew what had really happened. The trial that followed captivated the nation, but few understood the depth of the darkness that had led to that night. It wasn't just about greed, or inheritance, or power. It was about survival. It was about two brothers who had lived in a gilded cage of fear and abuse, who had been pushed to the edge by a father who controlled every breath they took. The Menéndez brothers are remembered for their crime, but what the world never saw was the years of manipulation, secrets, and desperation that drove them to do the unthinkable.